Imagine for a moment that you're about to experience one of the most significant moments of your life. You've saved every single dollar you could earn. You've worked overtime shifts, you've skipped meals, you've put off buying things you needed because this one moment matters more than anything else in the world. And then imagine that in the midst of that moment, something happens that you could never have predicted, something so extraordinary that it becomes the defining story your family tells for the next 50 years. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a true story that unfolded on a Tuesday evening in June 1972 in Las Vegas, Nevada. And it involves one of the most famous entertainers in American history making a decision that would ripple through time, affecting not just a people, but 3 generations of an entire family. More importantly, it's a story about what true generosity really means when nobody is watching. Let's go back to the beginning. The year was 1972. It was a different America in many ways. The Vietnam War was still ongoing. Richard Nixon was president. And Las Vegas was in its golden age as the entertainment capital of the world. The Sands Hotel and Casino was one of the crown jewels of the Strip. It wasn't the biggest hotel in Las Vegas, but it was arguably the most prestigious. The Sands had hosted the Rat Pack. Frank Sinatra had performed there countless times. Sammy Davis Jr. had graced its stages. It was a place where Hollywood royalty came to perform, and where high rollers came to gamble away fortunes. The casino floor never closed. It never quieted down. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sound of slot machines ringing, the excited shouts of people winning at craps tables, the sophisticated chatter of well-dressed guests made the Sands feel like the epicenter of glamour and excess. The restaurants in the Sands were world-class. The wine cellars were stocked with some of the finest bottles in the world. Everything about the hotel whispered elegance and refinement. To be invited to perform at the Sands was a mark of supreme success. To stay there was a luxury most people could only dream about. On this particular Tuesday evening in June, Dean Martin was preparing for his second performance of the night. Dean Martin wasn't just a famous entertainer. By 1972, he had become an institution. He was the ultimate embodiment of cool. He was handsome in that effortless, charismatic way that made people believe they had just bumped into old friends when they saw him on screen or on stage. He had a successful movie career. He had hosted the Academy Awards multiple times. He had his own television show. He had sold millions of records. And most importantly, he had a voice that could make grown men cry and women fall in love. The first show of the evening had ended at 7 o'clock. He had 3 hours before his second performance at 9. The crowd for the first show had been massive, more than 1,500 people packed into the main showroom, all paying premium prices for the privilege of seeing Dean Martin perform live. The second show would be equally packed, with about the same number of spectators. Dean had performed so many times that the routine was automatic. Get to the hotel, do a quick sound check. Spend the couple of hours between shows relaxing, maybe having a drink with the band, maybe taking a short nap. Then back on stage to do it all over again. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. There was nothing quite like the feeling of connecting with an audience, of making thousands of people forget their problems for a couple of hours and just enjoy being alive. But on this particular night, something was different about Dean's mood. He felt restless. The dressing room felt too small. His band members were friendly enough, but he wasn't in the mood for conversation. He had everything he could possibly want: success, wealth, fame, respect, and yet there was something gnawing at him, some sense that something was missing. So Dean made a decision that was entirely out of character. He decided to walk through the hotel by himself, not to be seen necessarily, but to observe, to watch people. He had always been fascinated by people. He had come from nothing. Dino Crocetti, a kid from Steubenville, Ohio, whose father was a barber and whose mother was ambitious for him to become something more. He had worked as a boxer. He had sung in clubs. He had struggled for years before finally breaking through to become the legendary entertainer he was now. Maybe that's why he felt compelled to walk through the hotel and observe the guests. It grounded him. It reminded him of where he came from. It reminded him of the hunger he had felt when he was just starting out. Dean Martin walked through the casino slowly. He passed the high roller tables where men in expensive suits were betting thousands of dollars on a single hand of blackjack. He observed the desperation in some of their faces and the arrogance in others. He watched the slot machines and the people feeding coins into them, hoping that this would be the moment their luck changed. Some looked happy, many looked lost. He moved through the main hallway of the hotel, admiring the architectural details, the expensive paintings on the walls, the crystal chandeliers that cast sparkling light throughout the corridors. The Sands was indeed a palace of entertainment and indulgence, but then, near the bank of elevators on the ground floor, Dean noticed something that made him stop walking entirely. He saw a young woman in a simple white dress. It wasn't an expensive dress. You could tell immediately that it had been purchased from a department store, probably at a discount. It was modest and sweet, but there was nothing fancy about it. Her hair had been done up for the occasion. She was wearing makeup, but her eyes were red and puffy, and tears were streaming down her face. Standing next to her was a young man in a suit that didn't fit quite right. The suit was too large in the shoulders, and you could tell immediately that it wasn't his. He was probably borrowing it, maybe from a friend or a family member. The suit was dark and serviceable, but it had clearly been worn by someone else before. The young man's face was etched with concern and something else, something that looked like disappointment mixed with resignation. Dean had no idea who these two people were, but his entertainment instincts kicked in immediately. He recognized something in them. He recognized the look of people who had hoped for something more and were coming to terms with less. But there was something else too. There was a tenderness in the way the young man was trying to comfort the young woman. There was genuine care there. Dean stood to the side, watching. He didn't want to intrude, but he was too curious to simply walk away. He watched as the young woman wiped her eyes with a tissue. He watched as the young man pulled her close and whispered something in her ear. And then Dean heard the words that would change his evening, and ultimately changed the trajectory of those two lives forever. The young woman said, "I'm sorry, Tommy. I know you wanted to give me more. I know you wanted music and dancing and everything special, but this is enough. You're enough. That's all that matters." In that moment, Dean Martin understood exactly what was happening. These two young people were about to get married. They were doing it with very limited resources. And despite their love for each other, there was an underlying sadness because they couldn't give each other the elaborate, beautiful wedding they probably dreamed about. Now, you have to understand something about Dean Martin to understand why what happened next was so significant. By 1972, Dean Martin had become so famous, so insulated by his success, that he rarely interacted with regular people. He was constantly surrounded by agents, managers, band members, security, hotel staff. He was always on, always performing, always maintaining that cool, smooth persona that had made him famous. But in that moment, looking at those two kids, Dean Martin remembered something important. He remembered being that young man. He remembered not having enough money. He remembered wanting to give someone he loved the world, but only having pocket change to offer. He remembered the frustration of that, and the way it could make you feel less than, even when you knew intellectually that money didn't matter. Dean Martin had a choice in that moment. He could have walked back to his dressing room and thought nothing of it. He could have continued preparing for his show. He could have maintained his separation from the world of ordinary people. But Dean Martin made a different choice. He walked directly toward the young couple. The young woman was the first to notice him. Her eyes went wide. For a moment, she seemed confused, as if her mind couldn't quite process what she was seeing. The young man turned to see what she was looking at, and when his eyes landed on Dean Martin, his entire body seemed to tense up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tears on the young woman's face started to dry as shock replaced sadness. Dean Martin smiled. It was that famous smile that had graced movie screens and magazine covers. It was the smile that had made him one of the most beloved entertainers in America. He said, "Excuse me, folks. I couldn't help but notice you two look like you're heading somewhere important." The young woman found her voice first. "Oh my God. Oh my God. That's Dean Martin," the young man stammered. "Mr. Martin, we're sorry if we're in the way." Dean's smile broadened. "You're not in the way at all, pal. In fact, I think I'm the one who's in the way. Am I correct in assuming you two are about to get hitched?" The young woman nodded, still in shock. "Yes, sir. In about 15 minutes. Up in the chapel on the 3rd floor." Dean looked at her carefully. He looked at her dress. He looked at the young man's borrowed suit. He looked at the older woman standing a few feet away, holding a small bouquet of daisies that looked like they had been purchased at a gas station or a grocery store. The woman had a look of shock on her face too. She was clearly the bride's sister, Dean said gently. "And, let me guess, you're doing this without all the fancy stuff? No band, no singer, just you two and love." The young man Tomas felt a flush of embarrassment run through his body. "We don't have much money, Mr. Martin, but we have each other. That's what matters." Dean put his hand on Thomas's shoulder, and he looked him directly in the eye. "You know what, kid? You're absolutely right. That is what matters. But here's the thing. I grew up with nothing. I know what it's like to want to give someone you love the world, but only have pocket change to offer. And I also know that sometimes when you least expect it, a little magic shows up." Catherine the bride started crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of hope, instead of tears of disappointment. She asked, "Mr. Martin, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Dean interrupted her gently. "What I'm saying is that I've got about 90 minutes before I have to be on stage, and I can't think of a better way to spend them than making sure you two have a wedding you'll never forget. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to sing at your ceremony." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Thomas couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Catherine's hands went to her mouth, and she looked like she was going to faint. Mary, the sister, dropped the bouquet of daisies on the ground. Thomas finally managed to say, You want to sing at our wedding?" Dean smiled and gave a wink. "I don't want to. I need to. Trust me on this now. Come on. We've got a chapel waiting, and I've got a song in my heart." What happened next would become the most talked about moment in the history of the Sands Hotel, at least among the staff. It was the kind of story that hotel employees would tell each other for years. It was the kind of story that would be passed down to new employees. It was an urban legend, a beautiful, impossible-to-verify urban legend. At the time, Dean Martin walked with the young couple through the hallways of the Sands. They took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. The chapel was small, much smaller than any of them had expected. It was a simple room with about 10 wooden chairs arranged in rows. There was a simple altar at the front. There was a wooden cross on the wall. There were no decorations beyond that. There was no band. There was no sound system. It was as bare bones as a wedding chapel could possibly be. The justice of the peace was a man in his 60s who had performed 6 weddings that day already. He was tired, his feet ached, he was looking forward to clocking out for the day and going home. When Dean Martin walked through the door, the justice of the peace's eyes went wide, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually have a heart attack. His face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Dean didn't ask for permission. He didn't make a big announcement to the small group of people present. He simply walked to the front of the room, positioned himself to the side of the altar where he would have a good view of Thomas and Catherine, and nodded. He said simply, "All right, let's get you two married." Thomas and Catherine stood facing each other. Catherine's sister Mary sat in the first row, tears already streaming down her face. The justice of the peace, still visibly shocked, began to perform the ceremony. His voice shook. He fumbled his words. He had performed 6 weddings that day. But suddenly, with Dean Martin standing just 3 feet away, watching intently, he felt nervous in a way he had never felt before. But Thomas and Catherine weren't nervous. They were in a state of shock so profound that nervousness seemed irrelevant. They held each other's hands. Both of them were trembling. They could barely speak the vows. They stumbled over their words, but they got through it. And then came the moment that would define their lives forever. The justice of the peace said, "You may kiss the bride." And in that moment, Dean Martin began to sing. He didn't have a microphone. He didn't have a band to accompany him. He had nothing but his voice and his heart. But the acoustics in that small chapel were remarkable. His voice seemed to fill every corner of the room. It seemed to bounce off the walls and fill the air with warmth. He sang, "Everybody Loves Somebody." Not the recorded version with all its orchestral arrangements, not the slick radio-friendly version. This was Dean Martin singing from the heart, singing as if it was the most important performance he would ever give. Every word was filled with genuine emotion. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a blessing. It felt like a prayer. Thomas pulled Catherine close. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed. Her sobs were the kind that came from overwhelming emotion, joy mixed with shock, mixed with a sense of being loved by the universe in a way she could never have expected. Thomas held her tight, his own eyes wet with tears. His jaw was clenched. He felt like his heart was going to burst out of his chest. Mary was openly weeping. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. She had driven 12 hours from Ohio for what was supposed to be a simple, private ceremony. And now, she was watching Dean Martin sing at her sister's wedding. Even the justice of the peace, who had seen so many weddings and so many tears, found that he had to wipe his eyes. Something about Dean's voice, about the purity of the moment, about the love that was so evident in his singing. It cut through all the cynicism and weariness of the day. When Dean finished the song, he walked over to the newlyweds. He shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds. You take care of this lady. She's a gem." Then he turned to Catherine. He took her hand gently and kissed it. "And you, Mrs. Reynolds? You've got yourself a good man. I can tell you two are going to be very happy." Catherine found her voice, though it came out shaky and full of emotion. "Mr. Martin, I don't know how to thank you." Dean smiled with genuine warmth. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. Just love each other. That's all the thanks I need. Oh, and one more thing." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to Thomas. "Go have a nice dinner tonight somewhere fancy. On me." Thomas immediately tried to refuse. "Mr. Martin, we can't. That's too much." Dean's voice became firm, but it was a kind firmness. "Yes, you can, and you will. That's not a request. That's an order from an old guy who remembers what it was like to not have enough. Now, go enjoy your wedding night, and congratulations again." Dean Martin turned and walked out of the chapel as quietly as he had entered. He went back to his dressing room. He prepared for his 9 o'clock show, and he never mentioned the incident to anyone. Not his band members, not the hotel staff, not the press. He simply let it be. What he didn't know was that what he had done that night was going to echo forward through time in ways he could never have predicted. That night, Thomas and Catherine Reynolds left the Sands Hotel as a newly married couple. They used the $100 bill that Dean Martin had given them to have dinner at the hotel's finest restaurant. It was a restaurant that they never could have afforded on their own under any other circumstances. They ordered champagne, they ordered filet mignon, they ordered dessert. They sat at a table with white tablecloths and ate food that tasted like luxury itself. But more than the food, what they did was talk. They replayed every moment of the ceremony. They talked about the way Dean Martin had appeared out of nowhere. They talked about the kindness in his voice. They talked about the way his song had sounded in that small chapel. They talked about the way it felt to be so completely loved and valued by a stranger. At one point, Catherine asked Thomas, "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Thomas laughed. "Probably not, but I don't care. We know what happened. That's all that matters." What they didn't know was that what had happened that night was going to shape the entire trajectory of their lives. It wasn't just a beautiful memory, it was a lesson. It was a teaching moment about what true generosity looks like. It was a moment that demonstrated the difference one person can make when they choose to act with kindness instead of indifference. Over the next 50 years, Thomas and Catherine Reynolds became known in their community in Ohio as the couple who helped everyone. It wasn't a calculated thing. It wasn't something they did for recognition or publicity. It was simply who they became after that night. They paid for strangers' groceries. They helped young couples with wedding expenses. They donated to every charity that came their way. They opened their home to people who needed a place to stay. When they heard about a family struggling to pay medical bills, they would quietly pay some of those bills. When they heard about children who couldn't afford school supplies, they would buy them. When they learned about a local elementary school that needed new books for its library, they would donate hundreds of dollars. They lived modestly themselves. They didn't spend lavishly on themselves, but they gave generously to others. They adopted Dean Martin's lesson as their life philosophy, and that lesson spread to everyone around them. Their children grew up watching their parents' behavior. They watched their mother and father give to others without expectation of return. They watched them see people who were struggling and respond with generosity. They adopted the same values. They became generous people too. Their grandchildren learned the same values. The ripple effect of what Dean Martin did in that chapel on June 12, 1972, spread across 3 generations. It spread into countless acts of kindness. It spread into the lives of hundreds of people who were helped by Thomas and Catherine Reynolds and their family. But here's the remarkable part of the story. For 50 years, Thomas and Catherine never told anyone the full story. They never told their children. They never told their friends. They never even told their pastor. They kept Dean Martin's kindness as their own private treasure. It was something sacred between the two of them, something that they didn't need to share with anyone else. They didn't need the story to be validated by others. They didn't need people to believe them. The story was theirs, and that was enough. In 2022, 50 years after their wedding, Thomas and Catherine's family threw them a massive anniversary party. It was held in a banquet hall in Ohio. Their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren all gathered to celebrate a marriage that had lasted half a century. There were decorations, there was food, there were speeches. It was a beautiful celebration of a love that had endured for 50 years. At the party, their grandson Michael stood up to give a speech. He talked about his grandparents' generosity, he talked about their kindness, he talked about their unwavering love for each other and for everyone around them. And then he said something that made the entire room go silent. He said, "I never understood where Grandma and Grandpa learned to be so giving. They always just said it was the right thing to do. But last month, while helping Grandma clean out some old boxes, I found a photograph. It was from their wedding day. And on the back of that photograph were 5 words that I didn't understand. The day Dean saved us." Michael pulled out the photograph and held it up for everyone to see. It was a blurry, amateur shot taken by Mary with a cheap camera 50 years earlier. But there, clear as day, was Dean Martin standing next to Thomas and Catherine in that small chapel. His arm was around Catherine's shoulder. His smile was warm and genuine. It was unmistakable. The room gasped. Some people didn't believe what they were seeing. Some people thought it was a trick or a joke. Michael continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "So, I asked Grandma about it, and she told me a story that I'll never forget." Catherine stood up. Tears were already streaming down her face. Thomas, now 74 years old and using a cane, stood beside her. And for the first time in 50 years, they told the complete story of what Dean Martin had done for them. The room was speechless. As Thomas and Catherine recounted the events of that June evening in 1972, describing the way Dean Martin had appeared out of nowhere, the way he had offered to sing at their wedding, the way he had given them the $100 bill, people in the room began to cry. Some people laughed in disbelief, but everyone eventually understood finally why Thomas and Catherine had spent their entire lives giving to others. It wasn't just because it was the right thing to do, though that was certainly part of it. It was because they had been shown an example of what true generosity looked like, and they had decided to spend their lives emulating that example. Thomas said, his voice still strong despite his age, "Dean Martin didn't just sing at our wedding. He taught us what it means to be truly generous. He didn't do it for publicity. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't use it to boost his image. He did it because he saw 2 kids who needed a little magic, and he had the power to provide it. That lesson shaped everything we became. Everything I am today, everything Catherine is today, everything our children and grandchildren are. It all traces back to that moment," Catherine added. "Every time we helped someone over the years, every time we gave when we didn't have much to give, we thought about that night. We thought about Dean standing in that chapel, singing with all his heart for an audience of 3. We thought about the way he saw us, really saw us, and decided that we were worth his time and his talent and his generosity. That's real love. That's real generosity. And that's what we wanted our lives to represent." The story of Dean Martin stopping that wedding spread like wildfire after the anniversary party. Michael posted about it on social media, and it went viral. Within days, it was being shared millions of times. News outlets picked it up. Entertainment historians began researching it. Journalists tried to verify the details, and, remarkably, they found corroboration. Former staff members of the Sands Hotel came forward with their own memories of that night. A former security guard, now in his 90s, said, "I remember Dean coming back from somewhere that night before his 9 o'clock show. He had this look on his face like he'd just done something wonderful. He was humming 'Everybody Loves Somebody' to himself. I asked him if he was okay, and he just smiled and said, 'I just remembered why I got into this business.' I never knew what he meant until I read this story." A former hotel concierge recalled, "The chapel coordinator came down to the lobby that night absolutely beside herself. She kept saying, 'You won't believe what just happened. Dean Martin just sang at a wedding in our chapel.' We all thought she was joking or that she'd had too much to drink, but she insisted it was true. The next day she tried to tell the hotel manager, but he didn't believe her either. It became this urban legend among the staff. Some of us thought it was just a story that got passed around, but it was real." Other hotel employees came forward with similar recollections. There was a remarkable consistency to the stories. It really had happened. Dean Martin really had walked into that chapel. He really had sung at the ceremony. But the most poignant part of the story came later. In 2023, Catherine Reynolds passed away at the age of 73. She had lived a full life. She had been married to Thomas for 51 years. She had seen her children grow up and become good people. She had known her great-grandchildren. She had lived to see her grandchildren tell the world the story of Dean Martin's kindness. In one of her final interviews, before she passed away, Catherine was asked what she would say to Dean Martin if she could see him again. She smiled, and in that smile, you could see the same joy and wonder that she must have felt on her wedding day 50 years earlier. She said, "I would tell him, thank you, not just for the song, though that was beautiful, but thank you for showing us that fame and success mean nothing if you don't use them to lift others up. Thank you for seeing two scared kids and deciding that we mattered. Thank you for being the kind of man who would walk away from 3,000 paying fans to make two strangers feel loved." She paused, wiping away tears. "And I would tell him that, because of what he did, we spent 50 years trying to be a little bit like him. We tried to see people who needed magic, and we tried to provide it. We weren't famous. We didn't have his talent, we didn't have his resources, but we had his lesson. We had the example he set, and that changed everything. That changed our entire lives. That changed our children's lives. That changed our grandchildren's lives. And now, because of him, his lesson is being passed on to people he'll never meet, people he'll never know, but whose lives he's touched because of what he did that night." The story of Dean Martin and the Reynolds wedding is more than just a heartwarming tale. It's a reminder of what true generosity really looks like. It's not about grand gestures designed for the cameras. It's not about publicity. It's not about getting credit or recognition. It's not about using your power to make yourself look good. Real generosity is about seeing a moment where you can make a difference and choosing to act even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. Dean Martin never publicized what he did that night. He never mentioned it in interviews. He never used it to boost his image or his brand. He simply did it because it was the right thing to do. And that, perhaps more than any song he ever sang, any movie he ever made, any award he ever won, is the real legacy of Dean Martin. He showed us that true greatness isn't measured in terms of fame or success or wealth. True greatness is measured in the moments when you choose kindness over indifference, generosity over self-interest. Today, the chapel where Dean Martin sang for Thomas and Catherine Reynolds no longer exists. The Sands Hotel was demolished in 1996. The building is gone. The stage where Dean performed is gone. The restaurants where they ate their wedding dinner have been replaced by other establishments. But the impact of what happened in that small room on June 12, 1972, lives on. It lives on in 3 generations of the Reynolds family. It lives on in the countless people they helped over the years. It lives on in their children and grandchildren who learned from their example. And now, it lives on in everyone who hears this story and decides to do something kind for a stranger. Because that's what Dean Martin taught us that night. That's the lesson that echoed through 50 years of a family's life and is now echoing out into the world. Everybody loves somebody. It's simple, really. Almost deceptively so. In a world that teaches us to be guarded, to build walls, to protect ourselves from the chaos and cruelty that lurks around every corner, Dean Martin stood on that stage night after night and reminded us of something fundamental about human nature. Everyone, no matter who they are, where they come from, what they've done, or what's been done to them, everyone has someone they love. Everyone belongs to somebody. Everyone matters to someone. It's a message that cuts through the noise. It cuts through the anger and the violence and the endless cycle of people hurting people. It reminds us that beneath all the surface differences, beneath all the things that divide us, there's this common thread, the capacity to love and be loved. But there's more to it than that. And sometimes, when we're lucky, somebody loves everybody. Those words carry a different weight, because loving one person, loving your family, loving your circle, that's beautiful, and it's important. That's the foundation of human connection. But there are rare souls who transcend that natural, instinctive love. There are people who look out at the world, at all of it, the good and the broken and the suffering, and they choose to extend their compassion, their protection, their care to everyone around them. Dean embodied that. Not Dean Martin the performer, though he certainly tried, but Dean the man, Dean who stood between a friend and violence. Dean who didn't just protect those close to him, he protected the vulnerable. He stood against cruelty wherever he found it. He loved not just his family, but the idea of family itself. He understood that every person on that stage, in that audience, in that city, was somebody's loved one, that made them worthy of protection, that made them worthy of dignity. That kind of love universal, unconditional, extending outward to embrace even those you don't know, that's rare, that's precious, and that's what changes the world. Because this is what happens when you find somebody like that. When you know somebody like that, when you grow up in a family shaped by somebody like that, it doesn't just affect you, it ripples outward. It echoes through generations. Your children inherit it, your children's children inherit it, and eventually it touches strangers. It reaches people you'll never meet, people who will never know your name. That night in Vegas, Dean Martin sang about everybody loving somebody, but what he really taught us, what he really left us with, was the understanding that one person's decision to love everybody, to protect everybody, to stand up for what's right no matter the cost, can transform a family's entire legacy. It can transform the world. And that lesson, the one that started on that stage 50 years ago, the one that was lived out and reinforced and passed down through every choice Dean made after that moment, that lesson is still spreading. It's reaching people now. It's reaching you. It's asking you the same question it's been asking for 5 decades. Who do you love? And are you brave enough to love everybody? Because that's the real gift Dean Martin gave us. Not just a song, though the song is beautiful. Not just a moment, though the moment was unforgettable. But a challenge, an invitation. A reminder that love, real, active, sacrificial love's the most powerful force we have. And when we're lucky enough to meet somebody who loves everybody, we're witnessing something sacred. We're witnessing what humanity can be at its best. We're witnessing the future our families could have, the future our world could have, if we all chose to be that kind of somebody for somebody else. Everybody loves somebody. And sometimes, when we're lucky, somebody loves everybody. That's the lesson, that's the legacy. And it's still changing lives.